Hi, this is going to be a little bit long, so I hope you stick around with me because this is something that's really important to me and I have some things that I'd like to get off of my chest. So I am a third generation American. On my daddy's side of the family, we come from Mexico. As a matter of fact, I have native blood in me, which is fascinating. I would never have known that unless I had done Ancestry, but that's neither here nor there. So my family came to the United States in the early 20s. My grandmother was born in Brownsville, Texas, in the early 20s. So we came here when the borders were kind of open. And I never knew that. I always wondered how we got here, if we came here legally, etc. But it seems like we got here legally, according to my research. It wasn't until 1924 that the United States actually started enforcing border control. 1924 is when the U.S. passed the Immigration Act of 1924, and that's actually when they also created U.S. Border Patrol officially. The U.S. Immigration Act of 1924 basically said we only want white Northern Europeans in our country. As a matter of fact, they set a quota on Europeans because they wanted them in our country so badly. They completely banned Asian immigrants, and that's another conversation that we can have another time, but that's the gist of it. They created border control, and that's what it was like. The interesting piece is that the quotas didn't apply to Mexican citizens, nor did it apply to any other Latin American immigrants. So why was this? It was because U.S. industries needed the labor. Clear and simple. They needed cheap labor. So while Europe's doors were closing, right, our southern border was kept open just enough to bring in Mexican and Latin American workers. And so began this pattern: labor when convenient, exclusion when not convenient. So the Great Depression is when the convenience ends. So the Great Depression hit in the 1930s. The Great Depression was from 1929 to 1939. And so suddenly those same workers that we had invited into our country who'd helped feed our country were suddenly labeled as a problem. They were taking American jobs, sound familiar? They were taking American resources, sound familiar? And so cities across the United States, mostly the larger cities like Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, those places organize what's called repatriation drives. And they basically deported and pressured hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and Latin American immigrants and even US-born Mexican Americans to leave our country. So entire families who had lived here for years were suddenly loaded into trains and sent across the border, often without due process. So we brought them here when we needed them, and then we expelled them when things got tough. So now let's jump forward to World War II. World War II happens, it's the 1940s. All of a sudden, we need workers again. Why? Because all of our men were across the ocean fighting World War II. So we needed them to work in our factories, to work in our fields. So the U.S. goes to Mexico and they say, hey, we need your people again. So they sign what's called the Bracero program. 1942 to 1964, more than 4 million contracts were issued to temporary Mexican laborers to work in our country in the U.S. agriculture and railroad industries. But these workers at that point in time were not given a path to citizenship. They were just here on temporary visas. They also dealt with incredibly poor working conditions, with many of them living in barracks. They faced wage theft, and they had absolutely no labor protections. But still, they came here because they wanted the American dream, right? Although it wasn't really labeled that at the time. They wanted to come here because it was often better than living in the poverty they were living in their own countries. And because of this, the U.S. economy thrived. So then comes 1965, and this is when we had the Immigration and Nationality Act. This one ended these racial quotas, and that was a good thing, right? Because it's weird to have quotas to bring people into a country. And that's good, it's progress. But it also set limits on the number of Latin American people that could come to our country for the first time ever. So these same workers who had been encouraged to come and cross the border for decades, all of a sudden were told, no, now there's limits. There's only so many of you that can come to our country. So only a small number of visas were available. But farms still needed them. Industry still needed these workers. And this is the beginning of when illegal immigration occurs. We did this. So at this point, then, migration just moved underground. So let's flash forward a little bit now to 1986. So that's a big leap, right? From 1965 to 1986. So at that point in time, the U.S. passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, the IRCA. And this basically gave amnesty to about 3 million undocumented immigrants. Wow, it was unprecedented. And it was really a smart move, I think, on behalf of our country, and also a humane move, quite frankly. So about 2 million of those workers, those undocumented folks, were Mexican and Mexican Americans because they'd built their lives here. It was a huge step towards inclusion, but it also introduced employer sanctions and new enforcement systems that weren't really enforced, right? And we're still not really enforcing them to this day. We've always penalized the worker and not the businesses that break the law. So once again, we opened the door and shut the door at the same time. Does that make sense? So let's move forward to 1990s. Like this is crazy to me. So by the 1990s, border militarization exploded. We built fences, we built walls. We've always had walls. And I know this because I grew up going back and forth into Mexico as a youngster, as a young adult even. So, whatever. So we built fences, we built walls, we built detention centers, and we expanded deportation programs. But the U.S. economy still depended on these undocumented workers. Again, agriculture, construction, and now, so we added construction, we add domestic labor, and then service industries. And then 9/11 happened. Now, all of a sudden, immigration became a security issue, which I get. I understand. It makes sense. But this is where it all starts to kind of become gross to me. This is when ICE was created, the CPB was created, and DHS were created. Detention centers were suddenly full of people who, just like in the 20s, came here to help build America. We invited them in, and now we're deporting them and getting rid of them. And families were separated. And even now in our country, we quietly benefit from this system. Undocumented workers contribute billions in taxes each year, Social Security, Medicare, sales tax, but they receive almost none of the benefits, no matter what the politicians tell you. So this is a pattern that we keep recycling. We recruit the immigrant labor because we need it, then we vilify that exact same labor when it becomes uncomfortable for us or when social norms change. Then we reform, we restrict, and then we repeat. Lather, rinse, repeat. So all of this to say, when you hear these conversations about the border and illegal immigration or illegal aliens, y'all are disgusting. Quit saying that. Remember the history. Think about the history. We've invited them in and then we let them go. We exploit them is what we do. And it's time for that to stop. It's been 40 years since we had any major immigration reform, and the time to fix that is now. These folks deserve to be in our country if they helped build it. Thanks. Please share.